Hey there, leader, and welcome to Conversations for Leaders and Teams, where today we have Dr. Andrew Brough with us, coming to us from Knysna, South Africa. Dr. Brough is a global leadership and organizational development and e-learning specialist, professional speaker, lecturer, facilitator, and conference moderator. He is founder of the Brough Leadership Institute and has worked with thousands of leaders in many Fortune 500 companies and businesses, governments, and nonprofit organizations over the past 25 years and in more than 80 countries. That is amazing. Andy is also a registered chartered marketer and part of the external faculty for a number of universities in South Africa and abroad. And for all you Clifton Strengths enthusiasts, Dr. Brough leads with Maximizer, Achiever, Responsibility, Strategic, and Learner. Andy, welcome to the show. How are you?
Kelly, it really is such a privilege to be with you today, and I am fantastic. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, congratulations on the new book. This is exciting stuff.
Thank you so much.
You are welcome. So I'd love to, why don't you just kick us off and tell us a little bit about the gist of your book, The Exponential Effect. I love the name.
Great. The book weaves a thread that looks at leading self, leading others, leading teams, and leading for results.
Oh, so important.
I try to make the point that if you can't do the first thing, lead yourself, it's very difficult to lead anything else. And so the book has 12 chapters, 4 sections, and in each of those sections, 3 chapters, which look at one of those particular areas. And throughout that, I try and take a well-researched academic approach to the leadership principles. There are about 140 end notes for those of us who are interested in the academic stuff, but I've tried to make it accessible, Kelly, by using stories and interviews with people from a range of industries and sectors from different parts of the world, a strong emphasis on South African leaders, because of course that's my immediate focus. But there are interviews from people stateside as well, which I think help to bring a global feel to a topic which I think is front and center right now.
It sure is. And I love how, that whole self-leadership component, if you don't get that right, right? And so, and I don't think leaders think about that often, at least the ones that I've worked with. It's always, their focus, yes, is on the people. But if we're not showing up as good, healthy individual leaders, how can we possibly lead a healthy organization?
I agree, Kelly, and I would also add to that it's probably the most difficult form of leadership, leading self.
Hmm. Yeah. So what does that look like typically for the people that you work with?
Well, I think that there's been a very strong root now around positive psychology, and as you've already called out at the beginning of this interview, discovering your strengths and working around those. But I take a little bit deeper, and I ask questions around character.
Mm.
And so for me, I think if we can't answer the character question, we are really stuck at first base. And so I take a deep dive into what I see as the elements of character. I actually use a diamond as a metaphor. And just as a diamond has facets and is really evaluated in terms of the cut of the diamond and the color of the diamond and the clarity, so I think our character has different facets. And so I take the reader on a journey of self-examination
Mm.
around 4 elements of character.
And what are those 4 elements of character?
So I'd look at character from the basis, first of all, of identity. And I get the leader to ask questions around who am I? Who am I trying to be? I think many of us will struggle with the challenges of trying to be somebody that we're not,
Mm-hmm.
of the imposter syndrome, of
Yes.
comparison. And so I think leaders have to be secure in their own identity first. And as a Christian, I make the point very early on in that first chapter that my identity is rooted in how I see myself as a child of God and as a Christ follower. But I think for any reader, they have to come to that question and navigate that question of identity. I also think character is about integrity, but integrity is a difficult one, Kelly, because as I began to study integrity. We've often said that integrity is about just doing what you say you will do. But there have been some leaders who throughout history did that, and they weren't very good leaders. They were mass murderers. They were people who led genocides.
Mhm.
So if integrity is just doing what you say you will do, I think we're missing something. And so the moral element of integrity and tying that back to, values and transcendence and humanity, for me is very important. So a question of integrity with a moral rudder would be important.
Mm.
I also talk about character as intent. So, what is your intent? What is your agenda? Often, leadership, if leadership is influence, where's that line between positive ethical influence and manipulation?
That's a
If I'm
biggie right
leading,
there.
yeah, if I'm only leading for my own self gain, then I think it becomes very one sided. And then I also talk about character as insight. And insight is about, first of all, self awareness, emotional intelligence. It's about social awareness. So, your ability to have insight and empathy and understanding and care for others. But I also think it's about situational awareness, that ability to scan, to look forward, to recognize that the future is not one, but many, and that there is, in fact, not just a probable future for a leader, but also a preferred future, and that you can change the direction or the course on which you're going and that of your followers by using your insight to anticipate whatever may be coming in the other direction and then tracking a different course if necessary. So at the end of that first chapter, I asked the reader to evaluate how they see themselves in terms of character and really think about it in terms of those facets.
And I do like that about your book. Your book is set up really nice. I'll just say
Thank you.
that. Even though I haven't read it, I flipped through and I had a feel of how it's going to be. And so I really like those questions that you pose, within the pages, as well as the stories, how you have that set up. Um, so it looks like it's going to be a good read.
Thanks, Kelly.
You're welcome. So, if we were to take the individual leader and we're working on them, their character, how would that relay then into, let's just go to a team? How would
Right.
you see that?
So if we jump from the first part of the book, which is leading self, I do character, purpose, and resilience. And then I go to the second part, which is leading others. So now we look at trust and we
Mhm.
look at communication and we look at influence. And then I go to teams. And you could argue that these are artificial separations because everything I've talked about in leading self would apply to leading others, and everything there would apply to leading teams. But I think the team one is interesting, and it's particularly interesting now, Kelly, as organizations are having to navigate this world of work, which is underpinned by a separation of geography and culture and even time zones.
For sure.
So, there, I think the team question is around alignment, alignment around what I call a single unifying aim. And is everybody in the team able to articulate that clearly as a common purpose? The second thing I think is it's about conflict management. And here I make the point that conflict traditionally gets a pretty bad rap, I think. And what I talk about is this idea of creative abrasion, that
Mm,
some of the best teams are teams where they have deep and difficult conversations. But out of that, because they have an ability to reframe conflict as a positive,
right.
they use that to spur the team on to achieve a goal that they wouldn't necessarily achieve on their own. And that then segues into the third part of the team section, which is collaboration.
Mhm.
And I think in this new world of work, the ability to work across process and function, across project and managerial office, and to be able to navigate multiple stakeholders,
Mhm.
particularly where you're working with people who are not necessarily your direct reports, who you don't see around the water cooler that you might have, in a co-located team. All of that now becomes, I think, really critical in the team dynamic of a post-lockdown world.
Yeah, it sure does. And when I think about the times that we're in, and you mentioned conflict, I imagine that conflict has just kind of elevated itself. depending on the situation during these times. But I like how you said, and I am in agreement with that, about how conflict could actually position us forward, right? We can learn and grow from each other. We can have that creative abrasion. I love that. In order for us to yes, be on a team, yes, have a common purpose, and really be able to leverage that conflict, that abrasion, so we can move forward as a team together.
Kelly, what's really interesting is as we saw lockdown happen around the world, there were many companies I was working with, probably like you in your consultancy, who've been geared for this kind of work for the last 10, 12 years. It wasn't new to them. But there were others who suddenly sent people home,
Mhm.
told them to work out of their kitchen or their dining room or their second bedroom if they had one. And I had leaders saying to me, my own leader hasn't spoken a word to me. I've got no feedback. There's no support. I have others saying, I've been told to sit in front of my webcam with the Zoom on from 8 till 5 because they want to know what I'm up to.
Mhm.
And so we had this range of responses from a team dynamic as to how do you build trust virtually? And some of the traditional thinking that we've had around the stages of team dynamics actually don't work. When you and I come into a meeting like this, even though we've never met face to face, I have to come in assuming positive intent. I have to
That's
come
right.
in giving you my trust from the beginning, thinking, well, Kelly's not out to get me. Kelly's here to support me. We
That's
both
right.
want a good podcast here. If I'm trying to go through the storming, forming phases, we just don't have the luxury or the time for that. So I come into a virtual context assuming positive intent, building swift trust does make me more vulnerable, but I think
Mhm.
in the long term, you get much better results when you do that rather than trying to track a very long arc to get the team to that place of cohesion that you may well have in a more traditional co-located environment, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it sure does. It sure does. Because teams are really close to my heart. I love, reading and learning about teams and how they operate. And it goes back to, in the beginning, how you said about, the differences in people. And teams are made up of human beings,
Right.
different thoughts, different strategies on how to approach things, different personalities, different talents, different gifts. And so it is imperative that we do reach that collaboration. But I think that collaboration is just a piece of that puzzle, and that trust component, like Lencioni's, model with the triangle and,
Sure.
on the bottom. Um, how do you see your leaders really engaging in that trust aspect and building that trust during these times?
It's a great question, Kelly, and I think many of them are stuck.
Mm.
I make the point that we're probably more connected than ever,
Mhm.
but we're probably more isolated than ever. So we've got to work much harder as leaders to create the psychological safety
Yes.
and an environment in which people feel that they do have the freedom to comment, to experiment, to make mistakes, to
Mhm.
fail, and know that they're not going to be, kicked into touch simply because they failed at the first point. So I think we need to have honest conversations with leaders around trust and trust building. It does relate both to an ability to build trust intentionally over distance, but I think it's also about showing up and it's about competency. And in what I call a results only work environment, the best way you demonstrate trust is by delivering on what you've said you will do when you will do it to the best of your ability and to do that with excellence. And slowly, you then start to show that you have the gravitas and the ability. But I think in the virtual context, there isn't always time to do that. So the first moment you get, I talk about fractals in the beginning of the book, Kelly.
Hmm.
This idea that if you think about an organization that is self-replicating, fractals are self-replicating shapes. That just means that when you zoom in on that fractal, you get the same pattern recurring over and over again. So if you want trust in your organization, you need to show that at the team level. And if you want that at the
Mhm.
team level, you need to show that at the interpersonal level.
Right.
And if you want to be showing that at the interpersonal level, you need to demonstrate that individually. And I think now you start to get that replicating factor over and over again at multiple levels. I think too often leaders call for values and trust at an organizational level, but they don't always consider how that needs to be role modeled one on one or one to many in the way that they engage with people on a daily basis.
Yeah, I sometimes think and know, I should say, just know that there are times when leaders, they're not good at articulating the values even of the organization. And so if they're not able to articulate that, how are our people, right? The people that they're leading be able to articulate and live those out within the organization?
Well, in fact, I've spent a lot of time, as I'm sure you have, helping organizations articulate values when those same leaders have never taken the time to help their followers articulate personal values.
Yes.
And so I think it's got to be a both and. How can, and I make the point in the book that you can't expect somebody to be a brand ambassador
Hmm.
if they're not clear about their own personal values. So helping people discover those and then looking for ways that they can align who they are and give expression to that through the organization is much better than doing a top down imposition of this is what we stand for. Now you need to shape up or ship out.
Yeah. Yeah, too often I feel that leaders aren't painting their people into the picture of the organization. And then on the other hand, it, people need to give themselves permission to look and work for organizations where their personal values can align. And I think too many times we're just looking for a position and not necessarily what does this organization stand for? Why would I want to go work for this organization? And really ask those questions of the individual leader.
And I think, Kelly, not only are they often just looking for a position, but they're looking for a position of seniority.
Hmm.
And I would argue that in the new world of work, as organizations are much more matrixed, that they will be flatter,
Hmm.
that the levels of decision making will be much fewer, and not all of us are going to occupy the corner office. In fact, many of us may never have direct reports. And in fact, many of the stakeholders who we need to engage with really have no reason to follow us or listen to us because we have no formal authority. But that doesn't mean we can't lead. And in fact, this ability to influence without authority, I think, is going to be an even bigger factor in this new world of work. So understanding where you drive your influence from outside of position, I think is going to be
Hmm.
critical.
Yeah. And I love that about, influencing without authority, because just demonstrating your values and, your commitment to the workplace, I think, is crucial and can say a lot about a person and a leader looking at you regardless of if you have a title or not. And I am of that same mindset that we are called to lead regardless of if we're in that corner office or not. And that corner office does have a lot of headaches anyway.
Sure. That's even if you have an office anymore, Kelly, right? They
That's
might have
right.
left the building and
The corner
working
of
from
your
home, you know?
bedroom. That is the life in which we are leading right now,
Right.
living and leading. It's really an interesting time, and really seeing how leaders are showing up or not showing up. Like you said in the
Correct.
beginning, there's ones that want you to have the webcam on, for your 8-hour shift. Instead of building that trust and allowing your people to get the work done that they need
Mhm.
to. Yeah, what that would drive me absolutely nuts.
I actually saw something this week that I wanted to share with you, which
Yes.
is not in the book, but I just thought it's such a brilliant example of what we're talking about. There's a Norwegian telecom company um, who are called Telenor, Telenor, and their CEO is a guy called Zigve Brekke, and he says the key to working in a remote environment is to have a philosophy of what he calls tight, loose, tight. So tight is be very clear about your expectations, be absolutely specific about what you want, and then be loose. Give the person the freedom to go and do what they need to, when they need to do it, how they need to do it, and then be tight again in
Mm,
terms of holding them accountable to the output and the result. I think that's
that's
brilliant.
good.
Tight,
That is
loose, tight.
brilliant. Yes, I do like that a lot. I like that a lot. That's one thing Craig Rochelle talks about is, delegating authority. And when we delegate authority to people, we're saying that I trust you. Right. And that
Exactly.
when I first heard that, I'm like, okay, that makes so much sense. How many times have I been delegating tasks and not authority? And the importance of creating that trust by just saying, here you go. This is, I trust you to get this done. And I think during times of crisis, too many times it's tight all the time and not,
Right.
having that
Yeah.
flexibility, like you said.
So one of the things I do, Kelly, in part 4, when we get to leading for results, is I talk about execution, and we can have a discussion around that. But I also talk about accountability,
Mm,
because I do think delegation, we've got to be clear, what are we delegating here? So the
mm-hmm.
fact that you delegate something to me, you delegate responsibility,
Yes.
but the accountability still rests with you for the result as my leader. And I think very
Yes.
often we don't understand that responsibility can be delegated, but accountability cannot.
Yes.
And so it's critical that I can take accountability for what I do, but you can't delegate that to me. And I think very often leaders make the mistake that, well, because I've delegated to somebody else and they did or didn't do it, it's no longer my problem. Whereas, as one of your previous presidents said, the buck stops here. That understanding of accountability, I think, is something that we've got to revisit,
Yeah.
particularly in this new way of working.
Right. And for teams, if we went back to teams for a moment, and for teams to hold themselves accountable too,
Right.
within that team dynamic, it's not just if there's a team leader, it's like, hey, let's hold each other accountable. We are a team. If you have that common purpose, you need to have that mutual accountability as well.
And so, again, in that team section, I provide leaders with a set of questions that they can ask around alignment and accountability and really ensuring that we are on the same page.
Hmm.
Too often, when I work with teams and I ask individuals in the team, what is the purpose of this team? I've been in situations where I get as many answers as there are people, and then you wonder why there isn't commonality. And, oh, is that where we were supposed to be going? I didn't realize that. Or the other thing I've seen is a team leader who comes with a 7-page thesis
Mm,
on the purpose of our team. Nobody understands it. It doesn't make sense. So getting leaders to be crisp and concise and able to just, this is what we do here. This is our purpose. This is
right.
why we exist. And getting people on the team to be able to articulate that almost without even thinking, I think is critical to team
Yes.
dynamic and team effectiveness. And I use a couple of practical examples in the book. One is the salvage of the Costa Concordia, which
Mm,
was a massive cruise liner, which
yes.
went the wrong way and ended up on the rocks 7 or 8 years ago. And then a South African, Captain Nick Sloan, was actually tasked with uh, turning this thing around, power buckling it, massive big ocean liner, and over 18 months, billions of dollars, literally, certainly millions of dollars in salvaging. So I interviewed Nick around team dynamics and purpose and working cross culturally and dealing with conflict. And it's a really great story that I think brings to bear many of the principles that you and I would talk about from an academic perspective. But the stories, I think, bring some color and some life to those principles, Kelly.
Yeah, that's awesome. I can't wait to read now.
Good.
So how do you steer? We'll talk the ship. We'll steer. How do you steer for accountability when you're working with leaders and teams? What does that look like? How do you encourage
Well,
that?
yeah, I think there's a couple of things that you've got to do from an accountability perspective, and I want to just go to the framework that I give in the book, because I think what that does is it helps to really, position the critical ideas from how we do that. And I talk in the book about recognizing that accountability has a particular domain, What does that mean? You're asking me to be accountable for something, so that's important. I think the other thing about accountability is you are working within a specific context. So let me just read what I say here about accountability, because not only is it about responsibility and roles and timeframes and results, but I do think accountability must include questions around the person who is being tasked to do something. There must be somebody who holds that person to account. There must be a result,
Hmm.
and there must be a sanction for not being accountable or not achieving something, and there should also be a reward. So to
Yes.
me, those are the elements that one needs to have in a conversation around accountability. And in fact, Professor Bruce Winston helped me a lot with some of the work that he did, writing around accountability. So I must give him credit for some of that thinking, because I don't think we've had enough conversations, Kelly, around the accountability piece, really.
Yeah. And it shouldn't be a scary place.
No,
I feel that when I've
absolutely
been
not.
held accountable, and I'm thinking of some coaching conversations with me having a coach, because every great coach has a coach, and really being held accountable to some of the things on my action plan is when I really produced and when I performed
Right.
best. And I think if we can, move that, oh, I don't want to be held accountable, to will you please hold me accountable? I mean, that's a mindset shift for many leaders.
Well, for me, if we just play with the word, accountability is accounting for your abilities.
Hmm.
And it's also the ability to give account. And if you
Yes.
see it in that way, then a leader should and must be accountable. And I love that idea that originally it was a bookkeeping term. That's where it comes from. Tallying up,
Yeah.
what's come in and what's gone out. But I think it's now taken on a much broader meaning, Kelly. And so, from a leader's point of view, where it was just originally used to refer to a follower's obligations, I do see it now as the intersection between responsibility and relationship. And if you can
Mm.
understand accountability from that point of view, that it's because you trust me and because you want the best for me and because you want the best outcome for both of us, there's a mutual accountability and there's a willingness to be accountable. And I think the other dynamic is the peer accountability,
Hmm.
where, as you say, we can, as team members, hold each other accountable. I think that's an important element for high performing teams.
Hmm. For sure. I mean, if you're on a team because you hopefully want to create and add value to an organization, for sure. What is it going to take to get us there, right? Whatever it is. And please hold me accountable.
Right.
Leaders, listen, it's
and
okay.
I and I wonder how leaders listening to you say that would feel. Do some of them feel, well, that puts me in a vulnerable position, or that would mean maybe that I lose some of my positional authority? I would say no to both of those questions. I think, in fact, it makes you a much stronger leader
Sure
when you're
does.
willing to make that point, of I desire to be held accountable.
Yeah, and that vulnerability piece is, I
Right.
think leaders too often shy away from that, and so let's embrace vulnerability, and see exactly how your people are going to accept that and see that. I think that it's when leaders do show that vulnerability, for me, it's like I want to know more about that. It's showing that authentic person in front of me, whether it's like this or on a phone call or in an email, um, and just being able to embrace that vulnerability, I think, is crucial.
And I do talk about that in the trust piece, Kelly. I say that it's not just enough to be clear about what you want. You can build
Mhm.
trust, but if you can build vulnerability, now you are revealing something of yourself. You are
Yeah,
bringing people into your confidence. And that is, I think, for some people, a scary place.
sure it
And
is.
sometimes we ourselves don't want to go there because we're afraid of what we might see. When we're comfortable in the early parts of the identity and the purpose, then I think the vulnerability is easier because we've answered some of those earlier questions. Now, we may need to revisit them very regularly, as we do as leaders, and that's why coaching is so helpful. But I think if you've got that, I don't want to say taped, because do we ever have it taped? I'm not sure. But if we're growing in the character piece, then I think the vulnerability piece is that much easier. Would you agree?
I would agree. And especially if you've established that psychological safety that you talked about, which is so important for people to be able to come and not fear retaliation for the things
Right.
that they say. I think that that's a crucial part of it. Vulnerability, psychological safety, hand in hand,
Yeah,
right there.
absolutely.
Is there anything in your research that you found surprising as you were writing your book?
Well, that's a really interesting one, Kelly. And I realized that that final chapter on celebration, while it was probably the most joyous chapter to write, it was also the most difficult, in that I don't think, and I'm making a sweeping generalization here, so forgive me, but I don't think as leaders we always spend enough time celebrating people,
Thank
and
you.
celebrating people before we celebrate success. So I want to celebrate the person before the job. I want to celebrate the individual
Mm,
before the team, and I want to celebrate the team before the outcome. I
mm,
think we can be so task orientated, particularly in our Western culture, that we lose sight of the fact that it's people that make this happen,
sure
and we
is.
need to celebrate that. And so, one of my maybe not surprises, but one of my observations is that the celebration piece, I think, needs to be really expanded and
Hmm.
explored, and a lot more research needs to be done on the power of celebration. I was, as I was writing it, Kelly, we were about 100 days into our first lockdown. The COVID infection rate was climbing, as it is again now. We were seeing lots of bad news, and I felt a little bit disjointed that now I'm writing this celebration piece in the midst of the chaos. And yet I really felt that as a leader, you have to look for every opportunity to celebrate. And
Yes.
sometimes that could mean celebrating in the midst of failure. It
Hmm.
could mean celebrating in the midst of pain. It could mean, and I say this carefully, even celebrating in the midst of loss. And
Yes.
I have a personal example in that final chapter of my own father-in-law when he passed away. And I actually shared something of the eulogy that I wrote, where I said, Dad would have wanted us to celebrate. He would have wanted us to honor his life and the example of who he was. Yes, we mourn him, and
Hmm.
yes, we grieve, but even in that pain, we can celebrate. And I think, Kelly, it's navigating that right now, that we need to be sober minded, we need to be sensitive,
Hmm.
we need to understand that we're going through a global pandemic of scales that we've not seen before. But that doesn't mean, sensitively, that we can't find opportunities to celebrate leadership success.
Leaders, I hope your ears are perked up. Oh, Andy, I think that's awesome. I too agree with you there that we don't celebrate enough, and it does start with our people. And we can have the greatest organization outcomes in the world, but it's only because you have great people who are showing up front and center every day for you to create that. And so you're right. How are we knowing our people? Right. And really investing in that interpersonal relationship piece that we need to do as individuals for that self leadership, but we also need to understand our people and their uniqueness and how to communicate with them and celebrate and what matters to our people. I mean, so many leaders do not know what matters to your people. And the only way that you're going to understand what matters to your people and who they are is to have conversation with them.
And ultimately, as leaders, we get what we celebrate, right?
Hmm.
So if we focus on the things we really want, then that's where people will give their attention. So I think that's food for thought.
Yes. Oh, well, what else? What else is in your book that you'd like to talk about today?
So let's think. We've spoken about purpose and character. I tell you what is in there, Kelly, which was fascinating in terms of the research, was the third chapter is about resilience.
Mm.
And if you'd said to me 12 months ago that that would have been in the book, I probably would have put something else in. I won't go through the backstory of how I selected the 12 leadership principles. You and I know that there are hundreds of definitions of leadership and manifold elements and competencies and skills. So the 12 themselves, it was more about what do you leave out rather than what you put in.
Mm-hmm.
But the resilience piece I realized was absolutely critical. And here's the thing that I'd love to share with you about the resilience research, if I may. Um, Resilience is not just about bending and not breaking, as we've often thought about in the past. In fact, there's been some research that's been done from the military that looks at soldiers in combat and how they respond under stress. And we know that there's the first group that hits the combat zone and really struggles. And in fact, once they are out of that situation, they present with some kind of pathology and suffer what we call PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yes.
There's a second group which seems almost invulnerable and just kind of pushes through and gets to the end, and they have the grit and kind of soldier on, to use a phrase. But there's another group, Kelly, which I think is the interesting group, and these are people who really bend. They suffer physically, psychologically, emotionally, but almost not just in spite, but as a result of that trauma, they bounce forward.
Mm-hmm.
And psychologists call this post-traumatic growth,
Oh,
as opposed
wow.
to post-traumatic stress.
Love
Now,
that.
I would suggest as
I'm full of
leaders,
growth.
if we can, well, this is exactly the point. If we can tap into the post-traumatic growth, that we're all going through COVID-19 right now. I'm in a place where I'm saying, what can I learn about myself and about my leadership
Yeah.
as a result of this, not in spite of this? And
Right.
how can I grow as a leader, not just to be hanging on by the skin of my nails, but rather to embrace this and to thrive and
Mm-hmm.
to come out of this a better person and a better leader than I was. And so I do a bit of psychology there on, the sphere of concern versus the sphere of influence, the sense of coherence,
Mm.
that resilience helps when something is more understood or more manageable, or I recognize what I need to let go of, or what I need to take responsibility for. And I think it's also very important at a time like right now, Kelly, that for resilience, we also need to not look internally,
Mm-hmm.
and for those of us who are believers, to the Lord, but also be joining hands with those that can speak life and grace and favor and strength
Mm-hmm.
into us. And that's why we're placed in teams, so that we can be intentional about that. And I think even for people who are self-employed that are not part of a team,
Yeah.
that they would be intentional in their community to not just look for their resilience from within, but to find that support network, even if that is remotely,
Mm-hmm.
to help them through this time. So I do think that resilience is a choice. And I think some of us are doing better at the resilience piece than others. But I'm fascinated as a leader, Kelly, to ask, how can I tap into the post-traumatic growth
Mm-hmm.
rather than the post-traumatic stress?
Yeah. And I think that's a mindset shift right there.
It is. Absolutely.
Yeah, it for sure is. And when you said it, it's like, wow, yeah, I've I fit that column right there.
Right. And I want to be there too. I'm not always there,
Yeah.
I have to be honest, but I want to learn more about how to get into that sector in my business and in my family and in my marriage and in
Mm-hmm.
my leadership, that I would be characteristic of someone who represents that post-traumatic growth.
Yeah. And it's not about feeling like you're a failure if you we're all broken people. And I think too many
Absolutely.
times leaders
Yeah.
aren't seeing themselves as that human component of, I can be a broken person, but
Yeah.
I can still move forward. I can still have that growth mindset and position myself,
Exactly.
position my team, position my organization and my family for success, because of what I've gone through.
Absolutely. And I think that, our understanding of resilience maybe needs to change, Kelly. That it's not just being Teflon coated and being
That's right.
completely invulnerable. It's the ability and capability to endure and thrive even in the face of opposition. And I add to that by remaining true to your identity and purpose. So
Mm.
again, I go full circle and I kind of think if you are answering the character and purpose questions at times like this, when things are really tough, it seems easier to step into the resilience, I think.
Yeah, and it goes back to what you said at the beginning, that so many people don't know their values or their
Right,
purpose.
right.
And so for leaders to understand that and to, yes, the organization is an entity that has values and you do have a position there regardless of title or not. But what are you as far as your own personal values, your own personal your purpose? I think when you shed light on that, you are right that it is a light that can be shined where then you have the direction that you can go based on, whatever's going on in your life.
And you know, Kelly, every leadership study I've done, I mean, I'm a big fan of Bill George, and Discovering Your True North. I don't know if you know that book, and his whole piece around crucibles. So he makes the point that every leader who's ever achieved anything has gone through some personal crisis and some personal crucible and has gone through the other side. And I think that talks to even the work of John Hopkins Bloomberg. They have a School of Public Health and Resiliency. They have a
Mm.
Resiliency Science Institute. And Dr. George Everly says that resilience is the ability to withstand, to adapt to, or rebound from extreme challenges or adversity.
Mm.
And that seems to support what Bill George says, that we all are going to face crucibles.
Sure
There is
are.
no free pass in life to opposition and difficult times. I wish there was. But it does seem that there's a correlation between your ability to navigate the adversity and your ability to lead yourself and others. So, back to your question on the research, I think the resilience piece, a lot more is still got to be done
Mhm.
on that. And I know Marcus Buckingham has just put out a very interesting piece on resilience, specifically in the workplace, not just on personal resilience. But I'm very excited to see how that topic is moving front and center, Kelly. And I think there's a lot more that will come for us as leaders around the question of resilience at a personal level, at a team level, and at an organizational level.
Yeah, because now is the time to really explore that and what that means and how we can rise up and into that resilience component. For sure.
I'm not sure if you've seen, you must have in your research seen the VUCA model.
Oh,
It's something
yes.
that we've all used. I take the liberty in the book to add an R to the VUCA. So not only are we in a world that's volatile and uncertain and complex and ambiguous, but this is demonstrated by what I call recurrency.
Mm.
And what I'm living through right now is the fact that here I am in December. In South Africa, the COVID rate is climbing again. We've been here before. We were here, 6 months ago. It almost feels like an endless treadmill
Mhm.
cycle. And I think part of resilience is being able to understand that the recurrency means that even when you don't know the end, you keep going. So
Yes.
that's the VUCA minus, the VUCA positive: vision, understanding, clarity, agility. And the R is the resilience piece. So
Mm.
for the
Love
recurrency, we
that.
need resilience. And I've taken the liberty of adding those two R's into that model. I think it's pretty topical and timely right now.
Absolutely topical and timely for sure. So thank you for doing that.
Great.
That's what we like. Well, Andy, this has been a fantastic conversation. I loved learning about what's in your book and your research that you're doing. Great practical application, for leaders, teams, organizations, beginning with that self and that character and making sure that leaders are celebrating their people. For sure.
Kelly, it's been an absolute privilege. Thank you for reaching out to me and for all you're doing to just expand our horizons in terms of leadership. And just fantastic that across the miles today
Yes.
we could hook up and have this conversation.
Yes, it has been a joy. So thank you so much.
It's been my absolute pleasure.
All
Thanks,
right.
Kelly.
We'll see you soon. Bye bye.
Ciao, ciao.